This week's Torah reading is that of the Akeidah, or the binding of Isaac. It is a story about obedience, trusting faith, and the ultimate goal of the Abrahamic Covenant. We will also explore the ramifications associated with God's testing of those whom he loves. This is one of the most important Torah reading discussions of the Torah reading calendar year. Come, fellowship with us, and let's discuss the eternal mysteries of Yah's eternal words of life. And Shabbat Shalom, saints of the Most High. Welcome to the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. I'm Rod Thomas, and I want to thank you for fellowshipping with me here on this blessed day of rest. For it is here that we gather every Shabbat to delve into Jehovah's eternal mysteries, his eternal words of life, his instructions in righteousness, which, of course, is our constitution and the very foundation of our covenant relationship with the Creator of the universe. And as always, it is our hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections finds you, your families, your fellowships well and blessed. Well and blessed even in these perilous times we're living. But as I say every week, be firmly assured, our Elohim, our God, is still on the throne, and our Messiah, Yahushua HaMashiach, is still interceding on our behalf in the heavenly Mishkan. The battle has already been won, beloved. We are more than conquerors in Yahushua, our Master and Savior. All praise and glory and honor to our Father Jehovah. Hallelujah. Let's open in prayer. Father, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day of rest. This blessing that you have gifted us, that you've lavished upon us, your loved ones. Thank you, Father, for understanding of the truth of your Torah. Thank you for understanding and your relationship that we share and enjoy and have with you, our Father. Thank you for the provision of this covenant. Thank you for Yahushua, our Master, who made this covenant relationship possible. Thank you for all things, all blessings, large and small, known and unknown. Thank you, Father, for being with us, especially in these very trying times. So today, Father, as we come before your throne of mercy and we sit at your feet to learn of you and your ways, we ask on this set-apart day of the week that you will reveal your eternal truths to us in a powerful and mighty way. Open our eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts to receive those truths that you have for us. And may we be worthy, Father, of our calling and our chosen status. Bless each and every member therein of this flock, of this community. We love you and give you praise, Father. And it is in our Master's inimitable name, Yeshua Messiah, that we pray. Hallelujah. This is when our covenant relationship with God is tested. It is, or the Akeidah. It is the 19th reading of our 3-year Torah cycle. And as in all our previous studies, our text today will be coming from Robert Alter's English translation of Torah entitled The 5 Books of Moses. I want to begin our discussion here today by mentioning that this Torah reading is famously referred to as the binding of Isaac, or the Hebrew terminology Akeidah, which Akeidah means binding. Now, rabbinic thinking runs deep here in the Akeidah, which surprisingly recognizes the weightiness of this story that surrounds the unfolding Abrahamic Covenant promises. Unfortunately, these same rabbinic authorities, well, they reject or they miss entirely the prophetic shadow picture that is embedded in the Akeidah, that is staring them right in the face. The Akeidah is nothing short of the foreshadowing of the greatest story hardly ever told. It's an indication that Yah will flip the narrative in human history and make that which is normal to humanity inexplicable and of the miraculous. The Akeidah is obviously a foreshadowing of the passion of our Master Yehoshua and the redemption of humanity from enslavement to sin and from eternal separation from the Creator of the universe. It is clearly the precursor of the greatest event in human history. Let's begin our reading in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 2. 22. And I should have said this and I completely overlooked it. Our Torah reading this week, sorry, I apologize, is actually found in Genesis chapter 22. And we'll be reading from verses 1 all the way through verse 19. I apologize. I normally would keep that, but you get so deep into these things, you just kind of forget and overlook. I also ask your apologies. I apologize to you or forgiveness ahead of the game that I may have a little hack in my voice here today, a little coughing from time to time. I'm still kind of dealing with the math of that little bug I caught a few weeks ago. And that is a persistent hacking, not debilitating, but just enough to be annoying. So just want to say that to you. So Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19, we're going to begin with verse 1. And it reads, or the Robert Alter version reads, and it happened about these things. And it happened about these things. What things? Well, those things recorded in chapter 21 that involved Ishmael, the birth of Isaac or Yitzhak, and Abraham's relationship with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. Now, the time frame between those events recorded in chapter 21 and our Torah reading here today is uncertain. But the verse reads, and it happened after those things that God tested Abraham. It happened after these things that God tested Abraham. And he being Jehovah, said to him being Abraham, and he said, here I am. Here I am in the Hebrew is Hanani. Here I am. So Jehovah introduces here one of his immutable character traits, which is to test those whom he loves. And Jehovah tests his chosen ones for a few reasons. He tests them among many reasons does Father test us. He tests us, and he tests those who are those who he loves, his chosen ones, to one, humble them. Two, to see if they meet his standards of righteousness and obedience. 3, to examine the content and makeup of their hearts. That is big for Father. If you've been with me any length of time, I have harped on this. Father is an examiner, is a searcher of the hearts of man. The one character trait, the one trait of man that gets Father's attention every time is the state of one's hearts. If your heart's all messed up and your heart doesn't care about Father, it runs contrary to the ways of Father and so forth and so forth, I'll tell you now, you're not going to get his attention unless you are really, really bad. But if your heart is right, or if your heart is malleable to him and his ways, he may just turn toward you. And he turns toward you and grants you his attention and invites you to enter into a covenant relationship with him. So he tests to examine the content and makeup of his beloved's hearts. And 4, to determine if he or she will keep his commandments or not. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2 and verse 16, as well as Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. Now, many of us develop a false mindset that once we enter into covenant with the eternal, that it's clear sailing to the finish line or to salvation. It's going to be a highway to heaven, brothers. Well, that's what we used to sing in church. But these will experience no trouble or trials or be subject to testing because it's such a highway to heaven and things are going to just be working out so well. Now, in truth, we're not always tested. Some of us endure trials and such on a frequent basis, while others of us rarely, if ever, experience testings and trials or troubles. However, I would submit to you today that most of us have endured an appreciable degree of testings, and we may not have ever realized it. Probably the first set of tests we've experienced was when we came into this faith. We were required to give up everything for the Master, to take up our crosses, our stavros, and follow him, as indicated in Matthew chapter 10, verse 38. To count the cost of being in an exclusive covenant relationship with the Creator of the universe, as stipulated in Luke chapter 14, verse 28. And let us not overlook that many who came to Yeshua, as recorded in the Gospels, desiring to follow him, were rejected by Master because they had something in their lives that they weren't willing to part with. Like, let the dead bury the dead, sell all you have and follow me, and the like. Unfortunately, many come to this faith for various and sundry reasons, but they end up failing the first set of tests, which is to what? Die to self and give up everything in their lives to enter into that exclusive relationship with Jehovah. So the question that needs to be answered here is, are those who fail these tests in true covenant relationship with Jehovah? Assuming we pass the initial test, and let's say we enter into that true and substantive, trusting, obedient covenant relationship with Jehovah through Yehoshua Messiah, it must be known that we are subject to testings and trials and even troubles for the reasons previously stated. Coming into covenant with Jehovah does not in any way guarantee one will not be tested or tried of by Father. Father has tested, I would say, far better folks than us. As we've seen in today's readings, or we will see in today's reading, I would go so far as to say that we can count on a lifetime of testing and trials, because these are part and parcel of the sanctification process. Father deals with those whom he loves, and he chastises them. And that chastisement, that chastening, can take the form of testing. Yah's purpose in testing us is not to harm us, but to do good for us in the end. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 16. So you can pretty much guess, if he wants the best for us, he's going to test us. Wow, Rod's a poet and don't even know it. I never even... Well, if Yah wants the best for us, he's going to test us. That's the way it works. That's part and parcel of being in covenant with Father. So, contrary to conventional denominational wisdom, we're all subject to testing. We're all subject to trials. That's just the life that we've chosen as disciples of Yeshua. Look, even our master Yehoshua was tested. He was tried. First thing that comes to my mind is the testing in the wilderness with the enemy. He was tested. Yeshua was tested throughout his ministry. We are tested throughout our walk with Messiah. As I just mentioned, it may be apparent to us and it may not be apparent to us. And some of the biggest testing, again, is when we come into faith. Are we willing to keep the Sabbath? Are we willing to eat clean and or kosher? Are we willing to keep his holy days? Are we willing to keep his moral laws? Are we willing to die to self and do the very things, the elements of our covenant relationship with Father that require us to walk in Father's ways? And if we're not willing to just do that coming into faith, which a lot of people aren't, well, you failed the test. You're not going, and to answer that question I asked earlier, are people who fail that test coming into faith, are they actually in covenant with Father? I don't believe so. You can't be in covenant with Father if you're not willing to, well, there's a covenant. A covenant is agreement. Two can't walk together unless they both agree. So, we have to, Father agrees to be in covenant with us. He promises to keep his end of the bargain. It's up to us to keep our end of the bargain. So I'm saying, now maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here with this introductory testing, for lack of a better phrase. And maybe it's not so much of a test as a requirement to enter our faith community, but it is in a sense a test, especially coming into this faith where there are requirements to be in covenant with Father. And if you're not willing to bend to those stipulations of the agreement, the covenant agreement, then you cannot enter into true covenant agreement and relationship with Father. Now, the Hebrew term for test, as used in our reading here today, is nasal. Nasal. Now, again, apologies in advance for my butchering of Hebrew, but you know me, those of you who've been following me for any length of time know that I'm not adept to Hebrew by any stretch of the imagination. And let's just throw in Greek too. Koine Greek, biblical Hebrew. I'm tongue-tied. I'm too old to start learning it. Some people say, you're never too old, Rod. You should learn it. No. I do what Father tells me to do, and Father hasn't told Rod here to learn ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek. Now, the day he does tell me to do it, Rod is on it. He'll do it, but so far he hasn't. So I'm going to rely on the resources that he's given me, and I'm going to do the best I can to pronounce them and try to explain them and introduce them to you according to Father's good will. And I'll do my best. If I butcher them, that's why it's important for everyone to conduct their own studies and gain their own understanding. So, but the Hebrew here for testing is nasal. The Hebrew carries with it a sense of one who is being tested, being deserved of being lifted up, actually. Being lifted up, declared, or proclaimed. That is an interesting nuance to just test. Test has a very flat connotation to it. But when you look at testing from the Hebraic standpoint, you get this sense of someone or something about something is lifted up and attention is drawn to it. That thing deserves to be looked at, to be given attention to. Now, the thinking in ancient Hebrew, as it relates to Nassau, is that of a standard. When we're talking about lifting up something, we're talking about lifting up a standard, being specific here. That of a standard. You know what a standard is? It's like a little flag. It's like a little banner that nations or armies or whatever carry before them to draw attention and to single out them as a certain type of people, a certain type of entity or what have you. It draws attention to them and it lets you know, hey, we are here, we have arrived, blah, 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 let's get this thing going. Well, it's this understanding or sense of a standard that is raised or lifted up on a pole. A standard bearer that is likened unto a seed, though, that represents continuous. That's another little nuance of it. This sense of a seed that proliferates and continues to grow and divide and multiply. That is also an element of the standard bearer, that he has a quality of continuance, of significance, of staying power. It is something to lay hold to then. It has a significance. It has a value, something to admire and take notice of. So I hope with this little jawboning here of the ancient Hebrew word Nassau, that you kind of get a sense of the Hebraic understanding of the term instead of just the English understanding of a test. When we think of test here in the West, modern West, we're thinking about being in school and getting the paper handed to us by the teacher or the proctor or whoever, and you're answering questions or you're writing out something and you turn it in to see if you understood the material from the previous semester or year, what have you. It's a test, but there's so much substance to the Hebraic understanding of a test of Nassau. James, a.k.a. Yaakov, who was the half-brother of our master Yehoshua Messiah, wrote, "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial. Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." Oh, praise Yah. And that was James chapter 1, verse 12, the New American Standard Version rendering. Now, other English words that are often used interchangeably for the English term test or test in the plural, or the act of testing, include the English terms of temptation and trial. You'll often see these terms, trial and temptation, used interchangeably with test or test in the plural or testing. Now, trials generally, but not always, denote troubles or times of trouble. And these times of trouble or troubles in the plural, they serve to test one's faith. And I would refer you scripturally to Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Now, a test can be interchangeably viewed as a trial, and it tends to carry that connotation in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, that of a trial. Thus, a test is manifested in some form or type of a challenge, a difficult situation, if you will, a difficult time, difficult situation that is imposed by Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, however you declare his name, and imposed by Yah upon his chosen ones for various reasons. In this particular reading of ours today, here in Genesis chapter 22, we will find later on that Abba reveals to Abraham why he tested him so. And that was to confirm the level of his fear of him and his willingness, Abraham's willingness to not withhold his only son, the son of promise, the son of covenant, Yitzhak, Isaac, not to withhold his son from Jehovah. Beloved, are we willing, as was Abraham, to give up unto Yah that very thing or things in our lives that we hold most dear? Indeed, we may be asked by Yah and tested of Yah to do that very thing. And so that's why we must count the cost associated with our covenant relationship with Jehovah, because there's going to come a time when we're going to have to make that choice. A lot of folk, brethren, today are facing this very thing. They're having to choose between Jehovah and their relationship with Jehovah, and they have, or the things that they hold dear in their lives. Look how many brethren are going through these so-called mandates. These things that these power brokers out there are subjecting the people of Yah to, where people are now having to choose between their beliefs, their faith, and their job. If you don't get this poison put in your body, yes, I said poison. If you don't get this poison put in your body, bye-bye, you don't keep your job. But if you want to keep your job, you'll get this poison. So a lot of us who are of faith have rejected this poison because, or for various reasons. I don't want to make this about any vaccines or mandates or anything like that, but we all know what's going on around us. We all know what's going on out there, and we all know what's behind it all and what it really means. But my point is that many of us are going through tests right now, and I wouldn't be so naive to believe that Yah may be testing many of us through that system. Many of brethren are being tested right now to determine, according to Yah, by Yah, whether they are really bought, sold unto him as his separated ones, his elect, his chosen ones, or are they really just kind of lukewarm, and when things get too tough, they rather choose the world than him? So we may be asked by Yah, and we may be tested by him to show him what we're made of, whether we're serious or not, what level our faith is at. And so we have to know that this is coming. Some of us may escape it this time, but eventually it's going to hit us all. There are no free lunches in faith, my brothers, my sisters. The faith cost. There's sacrifices involved with it. Now, as it relates to the English term trial, or trials in the plural, well, these are generally times of great difficulty or persecution that the elect of Yah are required to go through or endure. And one could say that these little things we just talked about with the mandates and all of the other poison being in blah, 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 and all of the other cancel culture and everything, well, that these may be trials. And certainly they probably are in some sense. But Yah allows, or he even requires his elect from time to time to go through these trials or difficult times. Why? For purposes of strengthening their faith and character. To test their mettle, their spiritual mettle, and so forth. Which begs the question, can a trial also be a test? I believe absolutely yes. Trials could be times of financial stress and challenges, health crises, relationship difficulties, and such. Indeed, such situations may serve to strengthen the elect's faith and character, but also they may serve to prove whether or not the elect one trust Yah. Trust Yah to bring them through whatever challenge or situation they may be enduring. I want to also point out to you as well that the English terms of test or trials should not be confused with temptation. Temptation, that is, to do evil. You see, the English term temptation, in particular in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, if you will, is often described as testing or trials, believe it or not. But contextually, when we are specifically referencing the English term temptation within the context of whatever text we're examining at the time, it is important that we make every effort to distinguish whether or not the author is talking about temptations that lead one or entices one to do evil, or some form of trial or testing to test one's mettle, spiritual constitution, and so forth, as we've been talking. You see, the nuance that must be recognized emphatically by every child of Yah is that, as James, the half-brother of our Master Yahushua, wrote, God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Let's put that in modern Western English. God can't be tempted with evil, and he doesn't tempt any man with evil or to do evil. But every man is tempted when Now, James does a fabulous job in delineating this point. Every man is tempted, according to James, when he is drawn away of his own lust. And then he's enticed. Then when lust has been conceived, it brings forth sin. When it is finished, brings forth death. And for your reference, that's James chapter 1, verses 13 through 15. So, when one goes through temptation related to evil, that's not a test. That's different. That is conceived within you. It is also, what's the word I want to use? It's also driven by the enemy. Hasatan is driven by our situations. It's driven by our selfishness, the deficiencies within us, and so forth, the darkness in our hearts, the uncircumcised heart, and so forth. Those are not tests. They have nothing to do with Yah. Just want to make that point clear. Is the temptation one of evil or of a testing or trial? That is the interpretative exercise we must enter into when we come across the English term temptation in Scripture. It's important to distinguish what that really means. Now, in the Torah and throughout the Tanakh being the Old Testament, and I have said also, and I agree with my brother Robert Bills, that the whole of the Tanakh, the 37 books of the Old Testament, can be considered Torah as well. Let's just say that the Tanakh, the Old Testament, as mentioned in particular, the Septuagint, or otherwise known as the LXX, tempted, or temptation is the term used to define what Yah put Abraham through in our reading here today. Thus, the Greek of the Torah, the Greek version of the Torah, yes, there is a Greek version of the Torah, written in the 4th century BC, I believe, in this case, uses the English term temptation to mean a test, but it has nothing to do with evil or sin. That's the difference. Again, that's what I mean by exploring and delineating the context in which the term is used. Testing is a character trait of our Father. Moving on. As it was of our Master Yehoshua. We talked last week about character traits of Father, that the Torah is not just a repository of Father's instructions in righteousness. That's generally what we have been indoctrinated to believe. And indoctrinate is the wrong word. I apologize. But that's what we all come to universally accept as Torah, Yah's instructions in righteousness. And that is 130% true. However, the other aspect, as we discussed last discussion, that's pretty bad. But anyway, as we discussed last time in Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections 18, Torah is also a repository for the character traits of our Father. It holds and describes Father's character traits, as well as it reveals to us how we are to respond to those character traits. In this case, testing is another character, an immutable character trait of our Father. And it was also an immutable character trait of our Master Yeshua. Torah talks extensively about Yah testing his chosen ones, in particular, Yisrael. In particular, we find through the writings of Jeremiah the prophet that Jehovah tries and that he searches the hearts of his beloved, of those who would be his. He tests the mind of his people. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 10. We personally naturally test things and people from time to time. We do it all the time. It's part of our trait. It's an inherent trait of humanity to determine whether a person, place, or thing meets certain criteria that we expect them to meet. And sometimes we do these things willingly or wittingly, and other times unwittingly or unnoticeably. It's just the way we are. We don't get close to a new person. Many of us are very, very careful, and we watch what we say. We watch how we conduct ourselves, and we keep people at a distance. Why? Because we're testing them to see what they're going to be like. If they actually meet a standard that is okay for us to, let's say, establish a relationship with them, we feel safe with them because they've shown over time that they possess certain characters that jive with our own kind of thing, if you understand what I mean. So tests or trials are an essential element of Yah's relationship with his chosen ones. It's to be expected. It's to be embraced even. Interestingly, this is the very first direct mention of Jehovah testing one of his own in Scripture. And this sets the stage for our understanding yet another immutable character trait of Jehovah, that he tests those who are his. And there are numerous scriptural references to this. And let me just throw them out to you really quick. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 2 and 5. 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 31. Job chapter 1, verses 8 through 22. And Job chapter 2, verses 3 through 10. Psalm chapter 66, verses 10 through 13. Daniel chapter 12, verse 10. Zechariah chapter 13, verse 9. The Apostle James chapter 1, verses 2 through 12. Brilliant reading. I love James. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Those are relevant biblical passages that support this understanding that Yah tests those whom he loves. Having to endure Yah's testing, then, is part of being in covenant with Jehovah, my friends. That's just the reality and truth of the matter. Even our master again, Yehoshua, was tested throughout his ministry, even unto death. So if he can be subjected to test, what makes us think that we can't? We are supposed to get out of it. See, that's the thing about walking in this faith of ours. Being criticized by denominationalists because we keep Torah, we keep those Torah instructions that we can keep, that we should keep, and our denominationalistic brethren or cousins, maybe it was a better one to describe, have a problem with that. And the thing that I don't understand is that why is it that the patriarchs, our brethren, from ancient times, even the apostles and all, were subject to keeping Torah. And yet, all of a sudden, because of divine revelation or progressive revelation, whatever that means, that now we don't have to keep it. And we don't have to keep it because Yeshua kept it. What? Because Yeshua kept it? We don't have to keep it? Anyway, that's just not a discussion about that, but that's the thing. We must stop this foolish thinking, this mindset that we are above and beyond that which the scriptures say we are subject to. And that is testing, trials, even tribulations. We are subject to those things. So let's stop thinking that we have this free lunch in our walk with Messiah. We don't. We're all subject to testing. I want to also point out to you that Father does restrict testing, or he doesn't restrict testing, I should say, to just himself, but rather Abba urges us even to try him as well, in a sense to test him. The psalmist wrote, over in Psalm chapter 34, verse 8. Oh, taste and see that Jehovah is good. Blessed is the man that trusts in him. You see, it's not that we try or test Yah's patience and we push him to a place that we are baiting him to see what he'll do, like our cousins wandering in the wilderness love to do from time to time, to just trying to entice Father into anger. No, that's not what our tasting and seeing of his goodness is supposed to be about. But rather, Yah gives us the opportunity to give Yah's way of life a try and see, as Kepha, aka Peter, wrote, taste that the Lord is gracious. Praise Yah. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 3. So we've looked at chapter 1 pretty extensively, and we focused primarily on this concept and issue of testing. Let's move on to verse 2. We will sneak a little bit back to verse 1 as we move along. We've got a lot to cover, and we've already into the 44-minute time frame for this post. But I do want to move on to verse 2 now. And verse 2 reads, and he said, take, pray, your son, your only one whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah, or Moriah, and offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall say to you. So Yah requests Abraham. He requests him as indicative of take, pray your son. So he requests Abraham, his friend, that scripture says is his friend, to take Yitzhak, Isaac, and offer him as a burnt offering. Where? In the land of Moriah, at a place in Moriah that Father will show Abraham. Quote, take, please. And please here is the inserted na. Take, please, Yitzhak, and go for thyself unto the land of Moriah, and cause him to ascend there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I speak unto you. That is the Young literal translation of verse 2. If you ever have a chance, I think you can get this version, Young's literal translation, you can access copies of it online free. Don't hold me to that. I need to verify that, but it's been around a number of years, so it may be in the public domain. But anyhow, that's the Young literal translation is always a nice little resource translation to have in order to get a sense of the rawness of the passage as opposed to some like the King James Version or some of the other authorized versions out there that kind of spruce up the wording in the verse to give it this more poetic, literary appeal, if you will. Now, the burnt offering, and some English translations even go so far as to say the Ascension Offering, referenced here, and that is hola, in the ancient Hebrew. Well, it carries the connotation or the sense of that which is, again, talking about lifted up. Lifted up. The root of the Hebrew term that is used, hola, suggests the act of lifting up. Anything that is high and lifted up. Now, the Septuagint, the LXX mentions specifically Yah instructing Abraham to offer Yitzhak or Isaac, and to do so at Moriah or Moriah, which carries prophetic implications for the discerning messianic surrounding not just the whole worship, the burnt offering ritual is outlined in Torah, but also the sacrifice of our Master Yahushua. We're going to get heavy into this as we continue on. But the KJV describes the required offering of Yitzhak by his father Abraham to be that of a burnt offering. What is a burnt offering? Well, we're going to get into that as we progress along in our 3-year Torah reading cycle. But just to lightly brush over, and that brush over is a bad word to use, a bad phrase, but just to kind of lightly touch upon what a burnt offering is in general, and this is not a thorough treatment of a burnt offering, so bear that in mind. There are other nuances that I won't cover here, but the burnt offering was, one, to be offered only to Yehovah, period. That's it. Number 2, specifically acceptable. It's an offering specifically acceptable unto Yehovah. Leviticus chapter 1, verses 9 through 17. Father wants this specifically to be within the confines of his exacting parameters. No part of this type of offering was to be shared or apportioned to the priest and the offerer. Many offerings, many types of offerings afforded the priest and even the offerer the opportunity to partake in the meat of the offering. But here in the burnt offering, the whole creature was to be burnt. The other thing is burnt offerings were the most ancient of all sacrifices. In fact, it goes all the way back to mentioning where Cain and Abel. The Cain and Abel story, Genesis chapter 4, verse 4. And also goes back to Noah, Genesis chapter 8, verse 20. And we understand that Job, the book of Job, is the oldest book. I'm getting tongue-tied here. Is the oldest book in the Bible, or it's been referenced as the oldest book. Well, Job is talked about offering burnt offerings on behalf of his children because his children were crazy kids. So he offered burnt offerings frequently on their behalf. The other thing is that the animal that is to be offered for a burnt offering was to be taken from either the flock, like the sheep or the goats, taken either from the flock or from the herd, like the cows, Leviticus chapter 1, verse 2, or from an acceptable family or class of fowl that could be offered as a burnt offering. The other thing is the general purpose of the burnt offering was for atonement of sin, Leviticus chapter 9, verse 7. Now, the guilt of the offerer, the one who is presenting the offering, the sacrifice, the guilty one, that guilt was to be transferred to the animal being sacrificed, specifically outlined here in Leviticus chapter 1, verse 4, and Numbers chapter 8, verse 12. And lastly, for our purposes, there are, of course, other particulars that are associated with whole burnt offerings, which we just won't address here in our discussion today. But it should be mentioned that Moriah is considered by many scholars to be the area where Solomon built the first temple. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. And indeed, there are significant prophetic implications associated with this testing of the patriarch of the Hebrew faith there at Moriah or Moriah. And it goes all the way to John chapter 3, verse 16. And I would further suggest that mention of the land of Moriah is indicative of that area, that place, Calvary or Golgotha, where our master was slain for our sins. We're kind of jumping here and there in this verse 2, so I hope you can stay with me. The strand of this verse that talks about where Father is talking to Abraham, and he says to him, your son, take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. Well, it's a curious strand. It's a curious one. In one vein, why is it curious? Okay. Well, in one vein, it would appear that either the writer or Jehovah himself is trying to get across which son he was asking Abraham to offer up as burnt offering on the mountains of Moriah. And that certainly could be the case, specifically given the fact that Abraham had two biological sons at this time. Ishmael, whose mother was Hagar, and then we just spent the last 2 or 3 Torah readings involving Ishmael and Hagar. And then there is Sarah's, because Hagar was Sarah's former handmaiden or slave girl. And then, of course, here is Yitzhak, Isaac, who the scriptures refer to as the son of promise, the son of covenant, Isaac, Yitzhak. However, the so-called rabbinic sages, in particular Rashi, weren't satisfied with such an explanation as to why Yah was so emphatic about spelling out which son. These sages pointed the finger at Abraham. And as dubious as their explanation may seem to us, it does offer up a beautiful nuance to this story, which in and of itself violates one of the basic commandments or mitzvot of Torah. You shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall you diminish aught from it, that you may keep the commandments of Jehovah your God, which I command you. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2. Now, despite this concern, I want to share this tidbit or midrash as popularly referred to in Jewish circles. And I want to do this because you're going to no doubt run into it at some point in your studies of this Torah reading. Now, according to Rashi, this discourse which is your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. Well, according to Rashi, the discourse went a little different. It was actually a discourse between, according to Rashi, between Abraham and father. And it goes like this. Father says to Abraham, I need you to go and offer up your son. Well, Abraham, says to father, look, I have two sons. Well, father responds. He says to Abraham, you're only one. Abraham says, this one is an only one to his mother. And this one is an only one to them. In other words, Ishmael is my son, but his mother is Hagar. Isaac is my son, but his mom is Sarah, and he's the son of promise. And so father says, you know what? Okay, Isaac. And this is a rabbinic midrash that is very well known and is spoken of a lot in rabbinic circles. And I found this to be very interesting. Now, how Rashi and others are able to deduce such a detailed exchange from a recorded one-sided conversation, which this text records, I don't know. I don't get it. But it can always be said of the rabbis, be it good or bad, that they do like a good story. And they go out of their way to really give us stories. Now, the rendering of the phrase, "you're only one," has resulted in some debate among Hebrew scholars over the centuries. One side has chosen to interpret this phrase using the Hebrew term yadid, which means a favored one. The other side, however, chose to interpret this phrase using the Masoretic Hebrew term Yahid, which of course is your only one. So we have Yadid, which is favored, versus Yahid, which is your only one. And this shouldn't matter to most, but when we drill down to the core of this whole Abrahamic adventure, the central theme must always return to regarding the Abraham's two sons is covenant. Covenant. As it relates to Abraham's life and relationship with Jehovah, which is entirely covenant-based, Yitzhak, Isaac, is Abraham's only son, period. Abraham's feelings regarding which of his two sons was his favorite are irrelevant, which says to us, our feelings and preferences in this life of ours become irrelevant when we enter into covenant with Jehovah through Yehoshua, our master, period. It's a different way of life. It's heaven's economy. It's different than it would otherwise be in the secular world. In the secular world, yes, you would have to go through that conversation. Which son are you talking about? I got two. I got Ishmael and I got Isaac. Which one? So I get that. But at some point, you got to stop playing in the secular world. You have to get past that mindset of the world and be heavenly minded. And Abraham would certainly, because of his relationship with Father, would have quickly known which one. And he would have known right from the start it was Isaac, because Isaac was the son of promise. He was the son of covenant. So what's the deal with Yah suggesting, here's the elephant in the room. What's the deal with Yah suggesting Abraham engage in the abominable sin of child sacrifices? You are going to read and hear about that whenever you study this passage, because the passage suggests that Father is instructing Abraham to take his little baby boy to the land of Moriah and sacrifice him. Well, let's look at this from a couple perspectives. From a secular, quasi-secular, or quasi-scholarly perspective, let's say, L, which is the Mesopotamian chief god, the chieftain god. Well, El is supposed to have required sacrificial offerings of every increase a worshiper in the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia would receive in their life, and that included their children. Abraham, hailing from the metropolitan Ur of the Chaldees, would no doubt have been acutely familiar with such worship practices. Child sacrifice, child offerings were common. Child sacrifice in the ancient Near East, it's centered around concerns of fertility and the promise of more children when the first of a couple's children would be offered to El. Jehovah, our Elohim, however, prohibited this heinous practice. Now, a lot of controversy surrounds this story in that it would seem, on the surface, if we're not paying attention, if we don't really do our studies, if we don't do a good job in studying, I should say, it would seem Jehovah is somehow in some way condoning child sacrifice by asking Abraham to sacrifice Yitzhak, his son. But this is not at all the case here. And I'm going to tell you why. We know that Yah sees child sacrifices as an abomination. And this is supported. It's documented in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 21, Leviticus chapter 20, verses 2 through 5, 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7, 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 10, Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 35, and holds those who participate in such abominable worship practices as responsible. And these who would participate in such heinous practices, abominable worship practices, they will face Yah's wrath personally. Nevertheless, Yah here is not in any way condoning child sacrifices by asking Abraham to offer up his son Yitzhak as a burnt offering unto him. To begin with, Yitzhak was by no stretch of the imagination a child here. He was very likely a young adult. We'll get more into that in just a little bit. Secondly, what Yah was asking Abraham to do was to show his trust and willingness to obey him, to obey Jehovah. In other words, do you, Abraham, trust me to the extent that you'd be willing to sacrifice your only beloved son, Yitzhak, to give him to me, as the heathen so readily sacrifice and give up their sons to their demigods? Are you willing to do that? Do we have that understanding? Do you have that level of trusting faith in me, of me? Are you, Abraham, willing to give up the very thing you love in this life the most, which is your son, Yitzhak? Now, we should take note that the text gives no indication that Abraham even bothered to engage Jehovah in a conversation or question about his request to offer up his son Yitzhak as a burnt offering. Recall previously that Abraham engaged Yah in a robust discussion regarding the saving of Sodom out of respect of the innocent ones of Sodom. Genesis chapter 18. Yet here, Abraham behaves differently toward Jehovah. There would be no discussion, no debate. At least the text offers no such discourse or evidence of such discourse between Abraham and Jehovah. What we have here is acceptance on the part of Abraham. What we have here is faith and obedience displayed on the part of Abraham. Why? Why no challenge or pleading on the part of Abraham for the life of his son? It should also be recognized that Abraham, like in the story of Job, had no clue that he was being tested of Yah. None. Yah does not let Abraham know he's testing him until he reveals the ram in the thicket until he reveals the ram in the thicket and commands Abraham to do no harm to his son Yitzhak. One could reason, as it relates to issues such as trusting faith and obedience, that the whole purpose, the whole point of a test would or might be lost if the one who is tested is told, hey, you, this is a test. This is only a test. Nevertheless, Abraham, after all these years and all he'd been through with Yah, is readily willing to walk in uncompromising, faithful obedience with his friend Jehovah and do what he's been instructed, or better, asked to do of Yah, as distasteful as it may seem to him at the time. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 7, and James chapter 2, verse 23. And here Yah asks of his friend Abraham to show him just how much he trusted and believed him, that he give up his beloved son for and to him. So the question that must be answered here is, although this which Jehovah asked Abraham to do, that being to offer up his son Yitzchak as a burnt offering, is a test of Abraham by Jehovah to determine the extent to which Abraham feared him, Yarayed him, verse 12, why did Abba choose the profane act of human sacrifice, or, as some say, child sacrifice, to test Abraham? Well, it is widely accepted that at the time this story is taking place, Yitzchak is no longer a child. Yes, many English translations, including Altars here, uses the descriptor lad for Yitzchak, or to describe Yitzchak. And some sources go so far as to assert that Yitzchak by this time was in his 20s or even 30s. So from our Western sensibilities, lad or child would not be an accurate understanding of the maturity of Yitzchak, of Isaac. Regardless, the idea of Abraham offering up his son as a burnt offering sacrifice should be problematic for us because he wasn't a child. Stop calling this a child sacrifice. He was a strapping young man. And who was Abraham? He was well over 100 years old. So there's no physical challenge here. Abraham was probably extremely good health and well over 100 years, but he would have been no challenge for the strapping Yitzchak who was in his 20s or even 30s. There would have been no contest. He's not going to subdue Yitzchak. Abraham's not going to do that. He can't. Clearly, this was not a case of Abraham being asked of Yah to offer up Yitzchak as a burnt offering for purposes of atoning for Abraham's sins. That's not the case here. As a tool to prove or test, again, the Hebrew term nasah, Abraham, to test Abraham, it is shrouded in mystery, in the mystery of the cross, the Stavros, the foreshadowing of the seed that would descend as a seed of Abraham and atone for the sins of humanity, and provide the means by which humanity may once again be in fellowship or in covenant with his Creator. This is clearly the 35,000-foot view of this thing, but the immediate perspective is that of testing, not sacrifice. That's where we go off when we focus on the request that Abraham offer him or his son Isaac for. The focus is on the testing. A sacrifice, especially that of the whole burnt ascension type, is always meant to exact a toll or hardship on the offerer. It is meant to hurt. It's meant to cost or mean something to the offerer. So the use of the term sacrifice to describe what is offering, what this offering was. It was to be a sacrifice. Well, the most powerful manifestation of a burnt offering sacrifice would involve some degree of personal relationship between the offering and the offerer. And of course, the most important relationship involving that of the relationship between the offering and between the offerer and Yehovah. The offerer and Yehovah. In this case, we see that deep, abiding relationship described in stark detail in verse 2. 1, take your son. 2, take your only son Isaac. 3, the one son whom you love. One cannot overlook the prophetic here, whereby Yehovah gave as an atonement for humanity his son, Yehoshua, his only son, the son whom he loved. I cannot overlook the nuance in verse 2 where Yah asked Abraham to offer up Yitzhak as a burnt offering, as opposed to directing or commanding him to do so. And that's another thing that detracts from this idea that Father was somehow coaxing or forcing Abraham to do something as heinous as human sacrifice or child sacrifice. Father here asked him, as we mentioned earlier, he asked his friend, take your only beloved son and sacrifice him unto me in the land of Moriah. The instructing and commanding flavor is found in most or the vast majority of English translations. They leave out the I pray thee aspect. But in some older Hebrew manuscripts like the Codex Leningrad, which is the oldest manuscript of the Tanakh in existence, the particle interjection of entreaty, it's called a particle interjection of entreaty or exhortation is found. That's where we get this, I pray thee. Unfortunately, most translators, for whatever reason, have chosen to ignore this entreaty and citing alleged difficulties in understanding or interpreting or rendering that inserted particle. The Young's literal translation and the Alter translations happen to be the only two English translations I have access to that actually acknowledge this inserted interjection of entreaty, that of I pray thee or I pray you, which I find very interesting. For me, it suggests that Abba was sort of giving Abraham the option of saying no to this jarring instruction to take Yitzhak to the mountains of Moriah and offer him up as a burnt offering or an ascension offering. It's as though this was a request Yah was making of Abraham, which also suggests the free will aspects associated with operating in covenant with Yah. Nevertheless, we still must come back to the reality that many, if not most, trials or tests come to Yah's elect without the elect's ability to opt out of the trial or test. And the one example that readily comes to mind is, of course, the story of Job. He did not have the ability to opt out of his trial or his test. I guess we can safely say that we who are in a covenant relationship with the Almighty are subject to testings and trials that have sort of an opt-out aspect to them. The one that readily comes to my mind is that of the Sabbath, for instance. We are given the option each week to keep the Shabbat and to keep it holy and all of the specific instructions that are attached to this mitzvah. And so each Sabbath, hundreds and thousands of us have the option of keeping Shabbat in spirit and in truth, and to not turn away our feet from the Sabbath and doing our own pleasure on Yah's holy day and calling the Sabbath a delight and not doing our own ways, nor finding our own pleasure, nor speaking our own words. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 13. To me, that is a test that many of us don't even realize that we are subjected to. It's a test that is given to us every week. Every feast day is that comes in the biblical calendar year is another test. When we go out to eat, another test. How we conduct ourselves in public, another test. These are all part and parcel of our experience in covenant living. Let's go to verse 3. And Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took his 2 lads with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the offering and rose and went to the place that God said to him. We quickly see in Father's request of Abraham similarities in what some consider to be Abraham's very first test, that being where Jehovah instructs Abraham to what? Get thee out of your country and from your kindred and from your father's house unto a land that I will show you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. In comparison, we have here similarly, Yah asking Jehovah to offer up his son Yitzchak somewhere in the land of Moriah at a place he being Yah, would show him. Indeed, as happened to Abraham in the land of Ur, here we see a repeat in Beersheba. Gather your things, Abraham, and head to a location that I will eventually show you. Just go. Trust me to lead you. That kind of thing. That isn't a major test. Most of us, even today, will not just get up and go without knowing exactly where we're going, because that's the way we are made. We want to know where am I going? You're not going to tell me? When I get there, you'll tell me? I don't know about that. You see, Jehovah desires that the reader not lose sight of the anguish that this test was costing him. Yah emphasizes the crucial reality of Isaac, his son, and Abraham as Yitzchak's father. The fact that Yitzchak being the son of promise and the son of covenant aside, Jehovah wanted to make sure that we, the reader, recognize the Yada relationship, the intimate father-son relationship that existed between these two. Now, the 2 lads of this verse is rendered by Alter in his translation are basically 2 of Abraham's young servants. The KJV, the King James Version, seems to render the description of these individuals as young men, which is infinitely better rendering, in my opinion, than lads. Interestingly, there are some ancient sources that classify males into their 20s and 30s as young men or even lads. So the text we have here before us seems to be following an ancient tradition of calling young men in their 20s and 30s even as lads. Really? But, that is the way it is. And that's the beauty of study. That is the beauty of digging in, actually understanding language and culture and history are so vitally important to our study. It's not about just reading, it's study, it's learning. It's because this is an ancient text and a lot of information is missing. Now, some Jewish sources, which they call a midrash, state that these 2 lads, this is interesting, identify them as Eliezer of Damascus. Remember him? He was Abraham's chief servant. So one of the lads, they say in this midrash, is that it was Eliezer of Damascus or Damasek. And the other, which I find very interesting, is Ishmael, son of Hagar. His daddy was Abraham. But I thought Ishmael and his mom were sent out packing into the desert. And ultimately, by this time, if indeed Ishmael was a grown, strapping man in his 20s and even 30s, he would have been married. And we know from the records that she ended up going into Egypt and selecting a wife for Ishmael. And then they ultimately left Egypt and settled in the wilderness. I'm not saying that they never had, that Ishmael and his family never had any further contact with the Abrahams, but at this point, it's kind of suspect whether or not one of these 2 lads, in air quotes, is Ishmael. So I just wanted to throw that out there as an aside, since it's a good chance at some point you're going to run into this information. Let's go to verses 4 and 5. And they read, "On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from afar." So he's getting into the land of Moriah at this point. Verse 5, "And Abraham said to his lads," those two strapping young men, which most of the translations say lads. Well, he tells those two lads to sit you here with the donkey and let me and the lad, this lad being Yitzchak or Isaac, let us walk ahead and worship and return to you. Keep this part of verse 5 in your brain because it is extremely relevant and important for you to understand here. He tells the two lads, stay here with the donkey. What a job. You stay here with the donkey. And look, me and Isaac, we're going to go ahead and we're going to worship. And worship involved sacrifices in the ancient Near East. And then we're going to return to you. We're going to return to you. Well, what is the mission here? Father asked Abraham to go and sacrifice Yitzchak, yet he's telling the lads, either he's telling them a lie, he's being deceptive to them, or something else, which I love. So again, Abraham instructs his two lads or young servants or the accompanying young men to hang behind and wait his and Yitzchak's return. And to me, this is the point in the story where we get an understanding of Abraham's perspective on what he is heading up to the hillside there in Moriah to do, and what he believes the outcome of that which Jehovah asked him to do would be. The text suggests that Abraham possessed such a trust in Yah. He possessed such a level of faith in Yah that he believed Yitzchak would survive this sacrifice, or maybe Yah would resurrect his son, presuming he went through with slaying him. For Abraham says to the young men that they were to hang back and await for his and Yitzchak's return. To make such a confident statement, Abraham had to have a tremendous amount of trust in Jehovah. For in the mind of Abraham, he and Yitzchak would return to the two awaiting servants. In my mind, as well as in the minds of other like-minded messianics, Abraham had to believe that Yitzchak would be resurrected. Otherwise, Yah's covenant promises would be nullified, right? Think about it. Meditate on this, beloved. This is powerful. We need to get away from this thought that Father is inciting human or child sacrifices here. This is not what this is all about. This is what is here, is what was on Abraham's mind. This is about the covenant relationship he had with Jehovah. This was about the trust and the obedience that was part and parcel of that covenant relationship. That's where we need to focus. Another way of rationalizing or maybe trying to read Abraham's mind here is that Jehovah is the smartest person in the room. And Abraham, trusted him to keep his covenant promises, even though that terrible thing that Yah asked him to do defies reasonable outcome and expectations of the covenant Yah established with him many, many years before. And here is where we also sort of get into the issue of the power of the resurrection. The mystery and power of the resurrection is built on the reality or built on the truth that Jehovah will always overcome any and every obstacle that the enemy may put forth to inhibit the fulfillment of Yah's established covenant promises. And what we have inscribed in this story, is this very thing, the Abrahamic Covenant being more than the promise of Yitzchak and of a land and of a progeny as vast as the stars of the heavens and the grains of sand on the seashore. It's also about the reconnecting of Jehovah with his human creation in covenant. It's about crushing the serpent's head. It's also about being victorious over sin and its penalty, which is death. It's about the resurrection. It's about eternal life. Glory to God. Glory to Yah. Praise him. All this flowed from the faith of Abraham. Abraham clearly trusted in the power of Yah to overcome death, even to the point of raising Yitzhak from the dead, if it came down to him having to actually slay Yitzhak. Beloved, this is the faith Yah is calling us to, that level of faith. And again, let us not overlook the faith of Yitzhak. Yitzhak's faith is a powerful testimony to the mantle that was passed down to him by his father, Abraham. It's a powerful statement to the power of raising our children within the framework of covenant and training them in the way they should go, such that they will not depart from the way. Okay, verse 6 and 7. And Abraham took the wood for the offering and put it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the cleaver. The cleaver in some English translations is knife, and the two of them went together. Verse 7. Excuse me. And Isaac said to Abraham his father, Father, and he said, Here I am, Hineni, my son. Here I am, my son. And he said, Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the offering? Abraham placing the wood on his son Yitzhak's back for the short trip up the Moriah or the Moriah hillside is enormously rich in the prophetic. Remember, Yehoshua, our master, in his agonizing journey on the Via Dolorosa to Calvary or Golgotha, we know that he carried part of that cross a short distance, a distance to his execution site. John chapter 19, verse 17. I personally believe the place where Yehoshua would ultimately be crucified is the place that Yitzhak's binding took place. Could that place also be the place where the temple was built or the brazen altar stood, which some advocate? Absolutely. I have no problem with that. I think we're talking about the general area. Remember, it's not Mount Moriah that the scriptural passage says. It's the land of Moriah. So we're not just talking about that one specific place. Now, the place that Father would show Abraham where to sacrifice Yitzhak is the mystery that we do not know. And so to think it's this place or that place emphatically would be a fool's errand. It's something to roll around in your brain and think about and really meditate on. And it's wonderful, the prophetic that's attached to it. But to be absolute is not possible. There's not enough information. But these are all part and parcel of the shadow pictures that Torah provides us, as stipulated in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1. So it was. Yitzhak bore the weight of the wood for the burnt offering, while his father Abraham carried the implements of the pending sacrifice, which was the knife or cleaver, as Alter renders it, and the fire. The text makes the point of the two, Abraham and Yitzhak, walking off to their destination together. Interestingly, the Onkelos, which is a rabbinic translation of the Torah, which serves as also a commentary. It's sort of a combination of a commentary and a translation all in one. It's a weird thing, but it's very interesting. But of this verse, the Onkelos reads, and they went both of them as one. I found that very, very poignant. And so it is evident that there existed a beautiful, trusting relationship at play here between these two, Abraham and his son Yitzchak. Obviously, Yitzchak had witnessed his father offer up numerous burnt offerings to Jehovah throughout his entire young life, no doubt also assisting his dad in rendering those sacrifices. This knowledge, this experience base, would have no doubt led to many questions in Yitzchak's mind as to what this sacrifice they were going to do was all about. There was no animal for the sacrifice, and the sacrifice was being done 3 days' journey from their home in Beersheba. Something was odd about this worship session. Nevertheless, there existed a great amount of trust on the part of Yitzchak. We talk about the faith or trust of Abraham, but we cannot overlook the tremendous trust Yitzchak had in his dad, Abraham, and in his Elohim, Yehovah. Let's not forget also that Daddy Abraham is well over 100 years old at this point. I brought this up. Yitzchak, probably in his 20s, maybe 30s. So there was no contest. So what am I saying here? Yitzchak went silently and willingly to this impending situation. He didn't fight his dad. He didn't resist his dad. Many of the Sunday schools of our youth led us to believe that Yitzchak in this story was an adolescent child who would easily be overcome and succumbed by his adult-aged father, Abraham. However, knowing that Yitzchak was much older than, I remember this movie that came out in the 60s. It was one of those epic, big budget movies called The Bible. And it had all the big stars, all the special effects. And it covered, I believe, from the creation all the way to, I think, this story, I believe. And it showed Isaac as a child, like an 8 or 10-year-old child. And that child, it was just so interesting. And that was so, it became indelible in my mind seeing that movie, because you try to look at these things when you're young and try to understand them. And it was very interesting to me. But knowing that Yitzchak was much older than an adolescent, it's beyond a safe bet that there would physically be no contest if Yitzchak chose not to go through with being bound and ultimately sacrificed. He could easily have taken his dad. I'm just saying. So Yitzchak was of complete trust in his dad and in his Elohim. Nevertheless, at this juncture in our story, the questions naturally lingered in Yitzchak's mind. Where is the lamb for the sacrifice, Dad? Yitzchak would have been acutely aware that no proper whole burnt offering sacrifice could be accomplished without a proper lamb. Verse 8, and Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for the offering, my son. And the two of them went together. The image Jehovah conveys here of the two, father and son, going toward the place where the sacrifice was to take place, it's a sobering one. Rashi wants us to see the two, Abraham and his son Yitzchak, as two individuals heading towards an inevitability, essentially on a mission, or more specifically, in one purpose. I've not really grasped the significance of what Rashi is saying here because of the unknown variable, that being Yitzchak up to this point did not know he was slated to be the sacrifice. So this thinking or image of the two walking toward the place of sacrifice together as the two being in one purpose, it sort of eludes me. It sort of escapes me, because you have to be in agreement. Each of you have to know where you're heading into. Well, Yitzchak did not know. But I can see from a broader perspective, I guess, that from maybe heaven's perspective, this is about purpose or mission. I don't know. What do you think? Or does it even matter? Probably not. So Abraham responds to his son's reasonable inquiry with one of the most poignant answers in the whole of Scripture. Elohim will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Now, the Jerusalem Targum, another rabbinic, I think it's of the first century, another commentary slash translation of the Torah, provides a very interesting rendering. It reads, the word of the Lord will prepare, the word of the Lord will prepare for me a lamb. And if not, then thou art the offering. Interesting, huh? Brutal. Woo! Nevertheless, what did Abraham mean when he responded to Yishak that Yah would provide himself or provide the sheep for the burnt offering? Well, the Hebrew text bears the sense that Jehovah would see for himself or look out for or see to it that a proper or acceptable lamb would be available for the impending sacrifice. Now, I have to ask, was Abraham speaking to his son in the prophetic here? Clearly, there is tremendous prophetic implications operating in here, in operation here. Did Abraham know something, suspect something in regards to the outcome of this thing? I think you kind of already know where I stand on this. Why did Abraham, withhold from Yitzhak that which Abraham was asked to do by Jehovah? Was this withholding of the information to spare maybe Yitzhak any emotional or psychological agony? Or did Yah's spirit lead Abraham in the withholding of this critical information for purposes of the prophecy, the foretelling, the foreshadowing being accomplished in the way that it did? I believe Abraham was operating in the prophetic, as well as he was operating in the trusting, faithful obedience that precluded any words on his part. At no time in this whole thing that Abraham refute or challenge that which Yah asked him to do. Why? I don't know. Clearly, Abraham is operating in something that is spiritually advanced and wonderful. Trust, faith, obedience, the prophetic. The Spirit was clearly guiding Abraham. I truly believe that. And since this was an expressed test, Abraham's trusting, faithful obedience allowed Yah's Spirit to lead the proceedings of this historic event. Beloved, I do not believe that Father abandoned Abraham in this trek toward the place he would show him, where he would build the altar, lay the wood, bind Isaac, and proceed to slay his son. I believe Yah's Spirit was with and operating in Abraham all the way. Why? Because Abraham opened himself up, being in covenant with Jehovah, to the operating of the Spirit in him. Let us not be falsely swayed. Father's Spirit operated in the set apart patriarchs of old. It wasn't just a New Testament thing, as many believe. So I do believe that because he opened himself to this, to being obedient, that Father was with him. In any event, it would appear that somehow Abraham was led to treat this unique event as though it was just another whole burnt offering worship session with the Almighty. He was not worried. He was probably emotionally challenged, but I don't believe he was worried. There is a deep emotional element to the exchange, however, that takes place between Abraham and Yitzhak. Yitzhak calls out to his father, "My father," to which Abraham responds, "I am here, son. Hineni." Beautiful. And so Yitzhak speaks to his father Abraham about the obvious. I see you got the wood, and I see you got the fire. Well, where is the lamb? And this, beloved, serves as a turning point for this story. No offering is valid without a proper sacrifice, a proper lamb. And for whatever reason Abraham had, he responds with a most profound but certainly most obvious explanation. Yah will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. In other words, don't worry, son, Jehovah's got this. I didn't forget that we needed a sacrificial lamb. I know I'm old, but I didn't forget. I'm trusting Jehovah to provide for himself the proper lamb for this sacrifice. Friends, if that revelation and statement of truth doesn't cause to well up in you from the very depths of your soul, praises and adoration for Elohim, I don't know what will. You can't make this stuff up. This can come only from the Ruach HaKodesh, the Ruach of Jehovah. But I'm led to ask, is Abraham's response here one that was based on his uncompromising faith or his obedience, or both? Obedience in that he or we must offer the sacrifice that Yah provide him or us. This would be indicative of our submitting ourselves to Yah's divine will, as Abraham is doing here in our reading. And this understanding of the response, let's say, could have potentially opened the door, at least in Abraham's mind, to probably Yitzhak being the actual final sacrifice that Yah asked him to make. In this case, Yah would not abandon his covenant promise to Abraham, and Jehovah would resurrect Yitzhak. That would have had to have happened. Yah does not lie. He has to keep his promises. Or better, of course, faith such that Yah would indeed provide another proper sacrifice in lieu of Yitzhak. I suggest, as I somewhat alluded to earlier, that Abraham's response to Yitzhak of Yah providing himself a lamb for the sacrifice was not limited to a substitutionary lamb in place of Yitzhak, or even Jehovah resurrecting Yitzhak in the event Abraham slew his son Yitzhak, but also the prophetic. Friends, this response, I believe, incorporated obedience and faith into a spiritual equation that served as a foretaste knowledge and understanding of something greater than Yitzhak and Abraham would have ever envisioned to take place at Moriah or Moriah. Yah would always provide his beloved a proper sacrifice in the here and now, as well as in the future, in the form of his beloved son, Yehoshua Messiah. In the case involving Yitzhak, Jehovah would provide a replacement sacrifice. In the case for humanity, Yehoshua would be the ultimate sacrifice, provided by Jehovah himself. Yehoshua, the perfect sacrifice. Yochanan, known as John the Immerser, emphatically stated of Yehoshua to those in earshot of him, "Behold the Lamb of Yah, the sacrificial lamb. Jehovah himself provides the world, which taketh away the sin of the world." Let's go on to verses 9 and 10. "And they came to the place that God had said to him, and Abraham built there an altar and laid out the wood and bound Isaac his son and placed him on the altar on top of the wood." This is the Akeidah, Verse 10, "And Abraham reached out his hand and took the cleaver to slaughter his son." Verse 11, "And the Lord's messenger called out to him being Abraham, from the heavens, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am," the third Hinene. The third Hinene. And here we have it, the third utterance of Hinene by Abraham. The first to Jehovah when he asked him to offer up Yitzhak, his only son. The second Hinene in response to Yitzhak's inquiry of the whereabouts of the sacrificial lamb. Hinene, my son. And now in response to the messenger of Yah, commanding him to not harm Yitzhak, his son. Hinene beautifully carries with it a sense of intimacy, of relationship, and of caring, of covenant. But even greater, Abraham's Hinene carries with it the sense of readiness, the sense of uncompromising obedience and trust. It's being able and willing to discern the still small voice of our Creator with a loving heart and ear and an uncompromising readiness to trust and obey Jehovah. Man, what does this say to us in how we must learn to respond to the still small voice of Jehovah our Elohim? Verse 12, and he said, do not reach out your hand against the lad. There's that lad again. And do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, and you have not held back your son, your only one, from me. And so the messenger instructs Abraham to not proceed with the slaying of his son. And it is here also that Abraham learns that this was a test. Verse 13, Abraham raised his eye and saw, and look, a ram was caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Beautiful. And here the realities of Abraham's prophecy is brought to fruition. Jehovah providing a proper lamb for the sacrifice. And Abraham obediently sacrifices that lamb that is provided him in lieu of Yitzchak. Verse 14, and Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, as is said to this day. That day in which Moshe was recording this event, on the mount of the Lord, there is sight. And of course, verses 15 through 19, and Jehovah's or the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham once again from the heavens. Verse 16, and he said, by my own self I swear, declares the Lord, that because you have done this thing, you passed my test, and you've not held back your son, your only one, I, verse 17, will greatly bless you and will greatly multiply your seed as the stars in the heavens and as the sand on the seashore. And your seed shall take hold of its enemies' gates. Verse 18, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your seed because you have listened to my voice. Verse 19, and Abraham returned to his lads, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelled in Beersheba. Beautiful. Tests, trials, they serve a number of purposes. Humbling, trying our faith and our obedience, purifying us, teaching us. Since test or trials is common to the elect of Yah, in order to save us much agony and turmoil, it behooves us during times of calm and quiet in our walk with Messiah to allow the Ruach HaKodesh to humble us, to increase our faith, to lead us into obedience and cleanse and purify us. It should also be noted that Jehovah will from time to time take us into a season of testing for purposes of teaching us how to receive his mercies and his grace. For when we open ourselves to hearing that still small voice of Yah with a readiness, or the readiness of Abraham's response of Hinene, I am here, Abba. The chances that we will hear his voice of mercy in the midst of the test will be increased. In other words, trials or testings, when we recognize them and embrace them, as counterintuitive as they may seem, build in us this sensitivity to Yah's word, his mercies, his righteousness, his justice. We've gone really long, and I don't make apologies. I used to, but I don't anymore. I gave you 75% of what I had, maybe even 70. And there's so much that I had to go over. I tell you, this is probably the meatiest Torah reading of all the Torah reading cycles up to this point. Of the 19 we've done, this is probably the one that has taken hold of me the most. It's the most powerful one that I've come into contact with during this 3-year reading cycle so far. There's going to be others, I know it, but this one, and I feel like I didn't do as great as I could have, because there's so much that I didn't cover, so much. And I just encourage you to do your own study, prayerfully, meditatively, if meditatively is such a word. But excuse that which I did not get to. But I pray that you will appreciate this concept of trust, of testing, I meant to say testing, and what it means to us who are in covenant with Jehovah. And look at the prophetic aspects of the Akeidah reading we have before us, the binding of Isaac, and what it means to us and what it means to the world and to creation. It's just so much. And it has really profoundly blessed me this go around. And I pray that if it even affects you, even if it blesses you 1/10 of what it's done for me this week, I will feel that Yah has given his stamp of approval. I love you, brethren. And as always, it is our hope, trust, and prayer that you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. Shavua Tov, Shabbat Shalom. Until next time, take care.